there was a tailor, and like many of her kind, she worked all the time for other people, but for herself. But one day a beautiful piece of cloth came across her counter, and she decided, today I'm going to make myself something. And so she picked up her scissors. She'd cut and she'd cut, and she sewed and she sewed, and she made herself a beautiful overcoat. And she wore that overcoat everywhere. She wore it when she went to the shadchan, the matchmaker, and met her husband. She wore it when they got married. She wore it to her first son's bris and to her first daughter's naming. She wore it and wore it and wore it until it was worn out. She took it off and laid it out on the counter, and her family gathered round, and they said, "Ah, come on, Ma, you're not going to keep that, are you?" "Mother, dear, get rid of it." And she said, "This holds our lives. It carries our memories." So she picked up her scissor, and she cut and she cut, and she sewed and she sewed, and she made a jacket. Now, if you want to bring that into the 1950s, that could have been my mother. My mother was an environmentalist before that was a trendy word or a trendy thing to be. She could find more uses for something old that should have been thrown out than anybody at all. Sophie wore that coat everywhere. She wore it when she took her children to school and when she picked them up. She wore it when she went to the market. She wore it when she went to the village, until it was worn out. Well, she took it off and laid it out again, and her family gathered round. "Oh, Mom, when you do that and you wear it, it's embarrassing." "Oh, really, Ma?" "Dear," but Sophie said, "How can I get rid of it? Look, this, it carries our lives. It holds our memories." So she picked up her scissors and cut and sewed, and she made herself a vest. Well, my mom saved. Let's see, she saved string and made little balls and rubber bands, and she had wrapping paper. We always reuse the wrapping paper and string and cut buttons and zippers off old things, and she washed out baggies, and she even reused saran wrap. Sophie wore that vest everywhere. She wore it when her son was bar mitzvahed and when her daughter was bat mitzvahed. She wore it to their confirmations and their graduations. She wore it when she took them to the shadchan to meet their prospective mates and when they got married. And wore it until it was worn out. She took it off, and at this point everybody was gathering around saying the same thing. "Mama, Mom, dear, get rid of it." But Sophie said, "How can I get rid of it? Look, it carries our lives, our memories." She cut and she cut and she sewed and she sewed, and she made herself a scarf. Well, I was a teenager in the 60s, and my mother and I fought about all these things. The way I figured it is you'd buy something new because you needed it, you'd use it and use it up, and then you'd throw it out, and that was that. Look, all I really wanted was to be like everyone else. Well, Sophie wore that scarf everywhere. She wore it when her children were married and when her first grandchild was born, and then her second. She wore it in town, in the synagogue, to the women's group until it was worn out. Well, she took it off, and everyone gathered around. Puppy! Grandma, what's with the scarf? Yeah, real, look at it, it's nasty. Dear, get rid of it. But Sophie laughed and said, how can I get rid of it? It holds our lives. It carries, this carries our memories. So she picked up her scissor and cut and sewed and made a pocket handkerchief. Well, my mom had a vegetable garden, and in that vegetable garden she used compost that she had. Well, she had the first compost pile. I'd never even heard of it. It was just rotting stuff as far as I was concerned. Oh, and pesticides. She never used anything toxic. Not my mom. She used marigolds to keep the bugs away. I hate to admit it, but she was right. Sophie took that pocket handkerchief everywhere. She took it to funerals and to fiestas, to synagogue, to her friends' homes, to her family, to her grandchildren, in the village, out of the village, until it was worn out. She took it out, she laid it on the counter. Everybody was there, and they all said the same thing. Grandma, my dear, get rid of it. How can I get rid of it? Look, it holds our lives. It carries our memories. She picked up her scissor and carefully cut and sewed. And she made a covered button that she sewed on an overcoat that she had just made for her eldest granddaughter, who the next day was going to be married. She looked at her granddaughter and she said, now, my darling, it is you who hold our lives. It is you who carry our memories. Well, when my mom died, my father and I cleaned out the house and got rid of all the cans and jars and bundled newspapers, and what I saved for last was her sewing machine drawers. I opened them up and looked at the jars of bobbins and spools of thread and buttons and zippers and rickrack and peasant binding, and then I pulled out one of the jars of buttons and I put it on the table and I started rifling through. I pulled out one button. It was a shell button that had gone on all my dad's dress shirts. And then I picked out this was a metal button. You know, brass button went on the pea coat set. It was either my older brother or older sister's. And then I picked out what was my favorite button. It was a light green plastic button with raised white and green rosettes. It had gone on my mother's bathrobe. And as I looked at them and all the rest, I realized it was my turn, for I would carry our history. I would hold all of our memories.